Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University Life Campus Conversation, the State of Our Union. My name is Joseph Greenwell. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I serve as the Vice President for Student Affairs in University Life. I'd like to first thank everyone for making time to join this conversation. For those of you who may be new to Columbia or to a University Life event this term, University Life serves as a student hub within Columbia, partnering with the schools and departments across the university to provide resources, to enhance the student experience, and to build community through programming, initiatives, and sharing information. Our core values are centered on equity and inclusion and a sense of belonging, sexual respect, and well-being. We value events like this that bring us together as a community to learn from different perspectives and engage in dialogue. And we're looking forward to digging into your questions in the second half of the conversation today. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor for today's event, which is the School of International and Public Affairs. Thank you for your partnership. I'd like to thank the University Life team, Michelle, Nina, Caroline, Radhika, Jessica, Ramona, everyone that had anything to do with making this happen. And I'd like to thank our panelists, which I will be talking more about shortly. I want to begin, though, by taking just a moment to kind of frame the discussion and to acknowledge why many of us are here today. The insurrection that we watched unfold on the afternoon of January 6th was shocking and deeply unsettling. It served as a potent reminder of our democracy's fragility. To many of us, it harkened back to frightened episodes, not just from the recent past, such as Charlottesville, but to darker chapters in American history that we have not fully reckoned with as a nation. The inauguration has now come and gone. The stakes leading up to the day were higher than I've ever remember in my lifetime due to COVID-19 and the need to reimagine a day of public gathering that celebrates the peaceful transfer of power after such a shocking, violent day 2 weeks ago. The inauguration was a welcome change of tone and moving in so many ways as a day of first. In Vice President Kamala Harris, we witness history as she is the first woman, the first African-American, and the first South Asian person to hold that office. We are also witnessing the appointments of the most diverse cabinet in history, including Black, Indigenous, and people of color, women, and the LGBTQ+ community. We're here today to take a moment as a community to step back from the churn of the headlines and the news clips and to reflect more deeply on the meaning of the last week's events. Our panelists today are here to help us to have a thoughtful conversation by considering the state of our union from multiple lenses and disciplines, including constitutional law, journalism, mental health and well-being, and public affairs and policy. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our campus experts, and from there, we'll jump right into hearing from our panelists and then move into Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the event by using the Q&A function on this webinar. Please note that I've shortened their bios because of time. All of today's speakers are incredible people with tremendous accomplishments. I want to encourage all of you to take a moment after this event to read their full bios when you have an opportunity. So I'm going to start with Gillian Metzger, Harlan Fiske Stone Professor of Constitutional Law and co-director of the Center for Constitutional Governance. A leading administrative and constitutional law scholar, Gillian Metzger writes and teaches in the areas of administrative law, constitutional law, and federal courts, with an emphasis on federalism and privatization. Gillian's recent work covers topics ranging from constitutional attacks on the administrative state to constitutionalism and the role of agencies in a polarized world. In 2015, Metzger won the American Bar Association's Administrative Law Section Annual Scholarship Award for The Constitutional Duty to Supervise, which examined presidential control and oversight of the modern administrative state. Previously, she served as Vice Dean of Intellectual Life at Columbia Law School. Before joining the law school, she worked as an attorney with the Brennan Center for Justice. Welcome, Gillian. Next, I'd like to introduce John A. Haskins, Dean of Student Life at the Graduate School of Journalism. John joined Columbia Journalism School as the Dean of Student Life in 2020. As the Dean, he oversees admissions and career development departments, as well as student life. John was previously an editor at the New York Times for more than 3 decades and directed the paper's Student Journalism Institute. Haskins began his career at the Times as a copy editor. He advanced to roles such as the managing director of the Times Magazine, senior editor in Paris, London, and Hong Kong, and editor of Escapes. Since 2017 at the Institute, he has directed the training of diverse young journalists, including our own Columbia Journalism School, who have gone on to work for the New York Times and other important outlets. Welcome, John. Next, I'm happy to present Dr. Aisha Holder, counseling psychologist with Columbia Health. Dr. Holder joined Columbia Health in 2015 as a postdoctoral psychology fellow and became a staff psychologist in 2016. Prior to joining Counseling and Psychological Services, she completed her internship at Princeton House Behavioral Health, as well as clinical psychology externships at Rockland Psychiatric Center, the Center for Study on Anorexia and Bulimia, and Iona College Counseling Center. Prior to pursuing a career in counseling, Aisha was the vice president at JP Morgan Chase in the Organizational Development and Corporate Training Group. Welcome, Aisha. Last but not least, Mayor Michael Nutter, the David N. Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice in Urban and Public Affairs, School of International and Public Affairs. After serving almost 15 years in the Philadelphia City Council, Michael A. Nutter was elected the 98th mayor of his hometown in November of 2007 and took office in January of 2008. At his inaugural address, Mayor Nutter pledged to lower crime, improve educational attainment rates, make Philadelphia the greenest city in America, and attract new businesses and residents to the city. He also promised to lead an ethical and transparent government focused on providing high quality, efficient, and effective customer service. With the support of an experienced professional staff, Mayor Nutter made significant progress on every pledge he made coming into office. I did want to share that Mayor Nutter had an unexpected thing come up, and he's planning on, if at all possible, to be joining us a little bit later in the program. And now, without further ado, I'd like to open the conversation by calling on you, Gillian, to share some thoughts from your perspective.
Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here. So it was very inspiring and very relieving yesterday to see the peaceful transfer of power and the country coalescing around affirming the legitimacy of the Biden presidency. And it was equally inspiring and relieving to see a government in place that is determined to address the many pending crises of the day, starting with the pandemic. That said, it's clear, I think, that there are very deep fissures in our democracy and our politics that endure and that are going to make the path forward for the Biden administration a challenging one. One fundamental issue is simply the deep partisan divides that continue to mark our politics. Partisan polarization has been an ongoing phenomenon for decades. Surveys reveal that today those divides remain extremely deep. Evidence of this kind of divide is, for example, the high number of Republican lawmakers who are willing to challenge Biden's election in the lead up to January 6th, but also in polls surveying views of the state of United States democracy, the issues that Republicans and Democrats see as pressing, and how they differentially view government. The politicization of the basic public health responses to the pandemic is a particularly salient example of how this kind of partisan divide has just shows itself in so many aspects of our country today. The insurrection of January 6th, I think, ultimately brought more cross-party unity on the election, but these wider divides continue to exist and will be, as I mentioned, I think a major challenge going forward. I thought I would highlight some institutional manifestations of this challenge. And so one, just to start with, is going to be getting new policy measures adopted. The closely divided Senate, the incentives for strong Republicans, the strong incentives, for Republicans to continue their party cohesion, and the resistance of key Democrats to overturning the filibuster means that getting more transformative legislation through Congress is going to be hard. I'm not expecting to see too much. Some will happen through bipartisan basis, particularly perhaps COVID responses. Some may happen through processes like reconciliation, but I think it's likely that the Biden administration is going to need to resort to unilateral executive actions to address many of the pressing issues on its place. And I think we saw that yesterday with the initial raft of executive orders that he signed. This likely reliance on executive actions is hardly unique. We saw it with President Obama. We saw it certainly with President Trump. And we saw indeed a slew of executive actions in the last few weeks of Trump's presidency. And I'm not particularly concerned myself about the legitimacy of Biden turning to executive actions. The executive branch has very broad delegated authority, and the popular sanction for such moves, I think, is probably strongest at the beginning of administration when the president has just won national office on the basis of the policies that he is advancing executively. But as the Biden's administration's efforts now to repeal Trump executive actions suggest, these kinds of moves on policy, these executive actions, are often less lasting, and they are therefore less able to resolve the issues that divide us and limit them as a source of division going forward. Executive actions also a lot of institutional capacity. And one of the biggest challenges facing the Biden administration is that executive branch capacity took a very significant hit under the Trump administration. There was a loss of substantial agency expertise across many agencies, loss of personnel, and at the same time, there was also a burrowing into the Secret Service of Trump political appointees. So a major challenge that is going to facing the Biden administration is sorting all that through, figuring out how to revitalize the executive branch. And it's not just a question of personnel, it's also having to fundamentally reconsider, I think, some agency structures that failed to protect the career civil service during the Trump administration. Moreover, some of the pressing issues that face the country are going to require a rethinking of major aspects of executive branch programs. This is, I think, particularly true of racial justice and inclusion initiatives. And one of the EOs yesterday, the Equity EO, is a prime example of it. It calls for agencies to undertake a review of whether different kinds of programs create barriers to underserved communities, and to plan in ways to ensure that all government services serve racial equity and other equity goals. It's a very exciting initiative, but again, it's one that's going to require substantial agency commitment and resources to implement well. And that again reinforces the urgency of addressing the current diminished executive branch capacity. Another unfortunate side effect of these executive actions is that they're very likely to be challenged in court. And I think there really is a pretty high risk of ongoing litigation at times being a barrier, perhaps a significant one, to implementing many actions and initiatives executively. Part of the reason for this is just the conservative turn in the federal courts under President Trump, who appointed a substantial number of federal judges. Part is also because of changes that we've seen in jurisprudence over the last 4 years, where one of the things that the courts have done is actually at times more searching judicial scrutiny of executive actions. That actually began under President Obama, it continued under President Trump. It meant many of President Trump's initiatives never actually went into effect, but it now could turn around and be an obstacle to the Biden administration's efforts to use executive power. And the other reason why I think we may very well see some significant litigation is just that administrative law litigation has become really a political weapon over the last couple of administrations, with a lot of suits brought by state governments that are controlled by the opposite party. So blue states led the charge against Trump administration actions in court, and I expect red states will do the same for Biden administration actions. And then finally, there is the risk that by turning to executive action, the Biden administration may worsen partisan divides. This is one thing that happened as a result of Obama's executive turn. And I think to some extent you could say the same thing about Trump's. Given the administration, the Biden administration's emphasis on unity that we heard yesterday, I think it's going to be interesting to see how strongly they do pursue some of the executive actions they've outlined beyond the immediate COVID emergency. On the other hand, not moving aggressively may create some tensions for them with more progressive elements in the Democratic Party. So again, a challenge in balancing the pressures on both sides there. So in short, where I come down is I think yesterday was an exciting beginning, but I think the challenges facing the incoming administration are quite sobering, and we will see how they address them.
Thank you so much, Gillian, in providing that really broad landscape for us and the challenges that the new administration is likely to face. And I'd like to move the conversation more to kind of the journalism lens, as it were, and more broadly. And so, Dean Haskins, can you share your thoughts, based on recent events and the inauguration and the State of the Union?
Well, thank you, everyone, for having me join this conversation, allowing me to speak a few minutes on this topic. We in journalism are very careful, especially daily journalism, not to call anything historic or write history before while it's still being written. So take everything I say with a grain of salt and know that it may be overtaken in a matter of days, if not minutes, in this. Let's be clear that I'm coming to this topic not so much as an academic, but because of my recent move, really more as a practitioner, more acquainted to the workings of the profession. And so that is my starting point. And I'll talk more about yesterday than the 6th, because I think, again, that's still sinking in. And I think we can say it was historic. All right, I'll go ahead and jump in and say that. As was yesterday. But I think I can speak for a number of journalists when I say there's a huge sense of relief now that administrations have changed. It's not that we can let up on our mission, which is largely to hold the powerful to account, but there is a sense that we are no longer an easy and constant punching bag for the most powerful person in the world. Now, he had a lot of punching bags, so I'm not asking anyone to feel sorry for journalists, certainly no more sorry for journalists than others, but it was the state of affairs for 4 years. So there is a real sense of relief. But of course, that won't last. There is a raging pandemic. There's probably an impeachment trial around the corner. There's a divided country, many, many years, centuries in the making, which means that even in the best of circumstances, it will take years to heal. And journalists have a role to play in all of that as urgently as ever. It's a time of fearlessness and clarity and of renewed mission going forward. And it's time for rebuilding trust. Now, you can cast blame on who tore away that trust, but it's still up to journalists to help rebuild that trust. And that's where we are right now. Let's stop a minute and talk about trust in the profession. While the calls for fake news, the very loud and persistent calls for fake news, are what's most memorable about the last 4 years, animosity from the Oval Office is not new. I don't think many people on this call can remember the days of President Nixon and Vice President Spiro Agnew, who both had little love for the industry. And certainly it was, the animosity predated that. It comes and goes. But what is new and what's new about the media landscape is the rise of social media, the increasing rise. I realize it's been around for quite some time, but it is its role as a primary news source for so many people in this country, a primary news source, not just a pastime. And the rise of a major news network whose programming can look a lot like unquestioning cheerleading for one particular personality. I'm talking about Fox. When you look at the people who have largely supported the outgoing president, And certainly the people who attacked the Capitol building, they are not readers of, for the most part, the Washington Post and viewers of CBS Morning News. And these are big sources of much of the information that has sustained millions of Trump supporters. Traditional journalistic outfits, the old school ones, like the ones I came from, and new ones that are entering the field must navigate this landscape to reach and build audiences. We simply must face this. It's not likely to change. Social media is not going anywhere. So a couple people can be kicked off, but it's still very much with us, and there will always be new platforms. And I'm sure Fox News or its replacements, if there happen to be, some will continue for many years. And so in a sense, the media landscape is vastly different than it's been before, with forces, very strong forces that shape the media landscape in a way that they haven't, or to an extent that they haven't before. That said, it's time for journalists to rebuild trust to the extent that they can. It is time for rebirth, or at least rejuvenation, of specifically local news for community building. That means covering regular people and their regular lives. That means making connections to communities, and it means building a sense of neighborliness, of shared hopes. Again, I'm not looking back at the golden age of journalism. There was certainly, there was the yellow age of yellow journalism that was in the last century too. So there was plenty of dark spots, but there was a time when most places had local news coverage where you could find your child's sports team, you could find wedding announcements and funeral announcements. And there was a sense that we were sort of all in this together. We live in a media landscape where there's not that. There's no trust. There's no shared mission. People get their news from all over the world. It's really, there's something that's been lost in that. And both small towns, big cities, big media companies realize that this is absolutely essential going forward. This sense of community building. We talk about unity. We talk about sort of being in all this together. Well, part of that, as far as a journalist in journalism, their role is to really share that sense, to publicize that sense of we're all in this together, or we all share the same challenges going forward. And there has been a reckoning for the past several years, and I think it's been intensified by the deep divisions in this country, that we really need to get back more into communities and build more journalistic sources. Efforts like Report for America are certainly doing it, and they're growing, but there have to be a lot more. But I think it's the role for journalists to really go into those communities and tell all stories, all the diverse stories. So in short, it's time for more journalism, a lot more journalism, a lot more journalists. It's time for more journalism education, which is where I come in. No, that's where the journalism school comes in, but also more basically, it's a time for more journalism education on the primary school level, a lot more lessons on news literacy. And it's time to go into the classrooms and inspire young people to be storytellers. This sounds a lot like I'm a little disconnected from what's happened in the last week, but I'm really trying to focus on what's the future. Trying to enjoy 30 seconds of relief after the last 4 years. But I also know that when you talk about unity going forward and the nation going forward and democracy going forward, something that is absolutely essential is that sense of trust of your neighbors, of your journalists, of your institutions. And that's where I see us right now.
Thank you so much, John. And your words really resonate, particularly around, trust and hope and unity. And these are all elements of well-being, right? It's all elements of our, all of these factors impact not only us as a country, but us as individuals and our individual well-being and support mechanisms. And I'm really grateful Dr. Holder is here, and would love to hear your thoughts through your lens, through counseling and other well-being perspectives.
Sure. Thank you, Joseph, and hello to everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this important conversation. Before I share a few self-care strategies, I think it's important to acknowledge the context in which I'm talking about self-care. And, indeed, we're living in such a stressful and chaotic time with much uncertainty. There's the public health crisis of COVID-19, which has negatively impacted virtually every aspect of our lives. And as a nation, we've suffered so greatly with a current death toll in the US of over 400,000. We continue to deal with the legacy and present day experiences of racial trauma and oppression. And as my fellow panelists have been describing, just 2 weeks ago, we experienced more trauma when we witnessed the violent attack on our nation's capital, which followed a divisive presidential election and political unrest and upheaval. And amid all of this, we must still manage our day-to-day challenges in our individual lives. And so by acknowledging these multiple stressors, I don't wish to create a feeling of pessimism. I'm simply pointing out these issues to help us to remind ourselves that this is not a time period that represents business as usual. These are just not typical times. But the good news is that we have an opportunity to find ways of coping during these really challenging times, with the hope that we have compassion and patience and grace as our foundation. So just to get into some, self-care strategies that I think are very helpful during such a time of unease, it's really important to validate what you're feeling. Try not to judge or criticize your feelings, but to observe them and think of your emotions as information. And by observing our emotions instead of judging them, it really allows us to gain insight into how to best care for ourselves in more compassionate ways. And this is particularly important when we're dealing in times of crisis, because we could have both immediate and delayed reactions and emotions when we're dealing with difficulties. And the practice of mindfulness is really helpful in this process. And that process is to be open to the reality of the present, allowing our thoughts, our emotions, our sensations to enter awareness without resistance or avoidance. And mindfulness helps us to embrace the truth of our experience, even if it is unpleasant. At the same time, mindfulness is really helpful for not becoming overly consumed by our negative thoughts or our feelings. And so when we ruminate about our suffering, it can exaggerate our experience. So when we experience disappointments, we don't have to conclude that life overall is disappointing. And so mindfulness allows us to have more balanced and objective perspective about our lives and ourselves. And I would say for those of you who are interested in learning more about mindfulness practices as students, we're offering virtual support spaces at CPS, Counseling and Psychological Services. So I encourage students to take a look at that. And I do recommend to my clients an app called Insight Timer that has wonderful mindfulness exercises that you can take a look at. The other self-care strategy I would offer is maintaining a daily routine. It's just really vital for our physical and mental health, again, during this crisis that we're in. Get dressed as though you're going to have plans to meet outside. Habits like getting dressed or making your bed reminds us that there really is a lot of life that's still happening, despite the disruptions and interruptions we're facing. Consider healthy activities like, listening to music or reading a book. Create a playlist that includes songs that provide some inspiration or hope and share it with a friend. It's really vital that we maintain a consistent sleep schedule. We're building in time for exercise and we're engaging in regular eating. And also to think about consider limiting your news and social media consumption. We can find a balance between staying informed, which is important for all of us, but we want to limit the consumption of negative news, which we know can intensify our worry and distress. But I would just say overall, allow for more flexibility and creativity as you're figuring out in your daily routine what works well and what may not be as helpful. Another strategy when we're dealing with a lot of chaos is community. Connecting with your community is so important. Connect with people who are going to demonstrate empathy and understanding and remind us that we are not alone in the midst of our difficulties. And, despite the constraints that we're experiencing in terms of socializing due to COVID-19, I always emphasize to students that social distancing does not mean social isolation. We have to be creative in utilizing these virtual platforms that we have to stay connected to people in our lives. Have a virtual book club meeting, a dance party, start a walking club where you can meet with fellow classmates and friends while, wearing your mask, socially distancing, but also getting that much needed connection. The key is whatever you decide, it's really important that it's consistent, that you establish consistent times to connect with others so that it's something that you can look forward to and it represents something that you can control. And we know when we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, what really helps with our wellness is finding that sphere of influence, the things that we can control when things feel so chaotic. Another strategy for managing during difficult times is self-compassion. It's a really powerful practice. It's essentially treating yourself like you would a close friend who is also having a difficult time. It's that process of being an inner ally versus an inner critic. It involves self-kindness, being warm, comforting, and understanding to ourselves instead of being self-critical when we experience difficulties. Now, it doesn't mean we don't hold ourselves accountable. That's often a myth around self-compassion. We could be kind to ourselves, but also acknowledge the areas where we want to continue to grow and to develop. What's really key about self-compassion is it acknowledges that the human experience, by definition, is not perfect, and that we are not alone when we experience adversity and suffering. And that can help when we're experiencing a time like what we're in, that there are people who are also experiencing adversity and we can connect to each other. And self-compassion also involves mindfulness, which I referenced earlier. My last suggestion for dealing in times of chaos is the practice of gratitude. I recognize it can be difficult to be grateful when we're experiencing adversity. I'm certainly grateful for the transition of power in this country. And so being grateful can represent a choice, an attitude that prevails with both triumphs and challenges in our lives. And when adversity happens, gratitude can provide a perspective from which we can view life in its entirety and not be overwhelmed by temporary circumstances. Now, being grateful does not mean we have to suppress our feelings or deny our hurt or pain of a situation. It allows us to think about how we can transform an obstacle into a greater good for ourselves as well as others. And a helpful concrete strategy around practicing gratitude is to keep a gratitude journal to remind yourself of positive things, things you enjoy, personal attributes, and valued people in your life. And as always, it's important to seek professional help if you're experiencing distress and it's adversely impacting your daily activities, but also know that you don't necessarily have to be in a crisis to seek professional help. And so you may contact Counseling and Psychological Services for the Morningside campus and Mental Health Services, CUIMC, for assistance. And I encourage you to check out our websites, and you could see a full description of the services we provide as well as tools. And I will leave you with these final thoughts to consider about self-care. That during times of crisis, that self-care represents intentionally caring for ourselves. It represents non-negotiable actions to promote our physical and psychological well-being. And self-care really represents an act of resistance, that in the midst of the chaos, we can still live, we can thrive by putting one foot in front of the other and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I know we talk a lot about well-being, you and I have to tell you, I always learn something every time you present. And so I so appreciate, and I've shared with you before, I practice gratitude every night. I think of 3 things at a minimum. I try to have more that I'm grateful for every day, and it really changes your perspective. In that, and I also think of 3 things I've accomplished, which isn't really, I mean, that's kind of centered around work, but that's also a well-being instead of focusing on what we haven't accomplished, which is oftentimes the case. So thank you for all of those tips. I got a few more that I'm going to try to do. So I want to remind our audience that you can put in questions in the Q&A box, and we will now open it up. Mayor Nutter hasn't joined us yet, and I'll keep an eye out for him in case he does, but we'll just go on into questions at this point in time. And I have received a few, and I'm going to read them, if you will. So the first one is, yesterday we heard in President Biden's inauguration speech clear calls for unity in order for the nation to move forward and battle the challenges in front of us. How does that square with the need for accountability generally, and specifically for the events in the Capitol in early January? Gillian, would you like to start in your thoughts on that question?
Sure. So, I mean, it's a very good question, and I think it's one of the tensions that will face the country going forward, and the leaders in Congress and the president. Um, in some sense, by going ahead and impeaching the President Trump, they have sort of put that on the table as something that will be going forward most likely in the future, but they've also given some room to move on other fronts as well. And I think one of the concerns is not just to try and achieve unity and not lead necessarily with the impeachment, if that is your the impeachment trial, if that is your goal. On the other hand, wanting to also move things on the Biden agenda, and in particular, there are some narrow windows for actions such as measures to kind of, there's a particular measure that called the Congressional Review Act, which allows for many regulatory actions to be overturned in Congress, but it takes a certain amount of time, floor time, and it's often hard to get the floor time to do that at the same time as the Senate is appointing key members of the cabinet. And so those are two other tasks that are really quite urgent at the same time as impeachment is looming, and that would be obviously an impeachment trial in the Senate. So I would think at a minimum there will be some balancing between those. I would think some of those actions to try and fill out the government and to try and take time-limited action on some regulatory moves would come first. And then I think part of the question will be how much of the accountability should come through an impeachment trial, and how much should come through actions, through criminal prosecutions that may very well happen at the state level or might happen at the Department of Justice level, and potentially also through civil actions. But it may well be that giving some time to do some other actions in the immediate future and turning to impeachment just once those have been done may help to achieve some of the dual goals that are facing the administration.
Thank you. We have another question. How can we, in our individual field, repair the image or brand of our country to our allies, partners, and perhaps more importantly, to our adversaries, especially after the event on January 6th? John?
Well, yes, I'm in the messaging business, or once was, so I'll try my best on that. And there's a couple of different things. One is as individuals. I think that was the beginning of the question. The other one is sort of collectively. I will go back to what I said about community and building a community. I don't mean to cast news media as an effort to cheerlead. What I do want to stress is the need to tell each other stories and to understand each other and to shine a light on it. And that isn't all about feeling good about, being on the high school football team. It may be about shared concerns about corruption in your local town. As far as sort of looking across the ocean or up north or down south and really sort of repairing that image, I think within the worlds of journalism, it has to do a lot with telling more stories, building a community that is a global community. And so it means, it seems like everything I say is about more journalism, not less, but I truly believe that. And so, there was a real pullback when there was the continued crisis when in media, especially newspapers, pulling back overseas correspondence and even domestic correspondence. Some more successful journalistic enterprises are beginning to send more people overseas. That's the easiest way that we do it. We build bridges, we tell stories. That's what we do. So within the field, I would say that, if you're talking about an individual and rebuilding relationships for your friends, relatives, maybe who are overseas, those relationships are probably have some strength left in them, either familial or, shared interests going back. You have to go back to what you share and concentrate on what you share, as opposed to necessarily tearing down something, because it's really more about, no one wants to be negative all the time. And this doesn't mean forgiving it. It certainly doesn't mean forgetting. It means healing. And so from my standpoint, it's two things. One, sharing more stories, reaching out to the people, the global community. And number two, underscoring the shared interests, positive and, again, shared negative, fighting hunger, fighting, disease, handling the pandemic. That's what's going to get us through this.
Thank you, John. We have a question, Aisha, that might fall more into your lens. I'm going to paraphrase this a bit, but how long will it take for individuals to recover from the fear and worry of recent events and actions by the former administration and that have been really created in people's political and social consciousness?
I think it's going to take a long time. The way that I've been talking about these events, not just what's been happening politically, but just from COVID-19, heightened racial tensions, is that this is a collective trauma. And what we know about trauma is that we can have immediate reactions, as I mentioned in my remarks, but we can also have delayed reactions. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to how we're feeling. And I know that we've been very focused, and rightfully so, on the physical health, right? And remaining safe because of COVID. But I think we really have to focus on the mental health toll of just the enormous chaos and uncertainty that we've been dealing with. So I think it will take some time, and that's okay, because healing is not always a linear process. It's one that we have to meet with compassion, that we can feel like we're making progress and then sometimes not have the best of days. And that's okay, because that's the arc of healing. I think we can get there, but we will have to think about really telling the truth about what we have been experiencing. As Dean Haskins mentioned, really telling stories is, I see such a parallel to the work that I do and my colleagues do, is that we're bearing witness to people's experiences and their stories, and there's so much power in that. And so we have to continue to tell the truth about our stories and have a variety of those stories being told, and create spaces, with people that you value and that you trust to talk about what we've been experiencing. And I think this is where the self-care is very important, is you think about how to care for yourself, which also allows you to be of service to others. So it will take some time, but it's not impossible to heal in our respective lives and also as a nation and globally.
Thank you, Aisha. We have another question. So we've seen that a driving factor of our division in the US has been misinformation. How can we most effectively combat sources of misinformation and encourage those who currently base their opinions on these sources to question their validity instead of immediately accepting them as truth? Dean Haskins?
And about the messaging.
Metzger,
I'll just say more. No, that's what I touched on. We live in a media landscape. It's so frustrating for me. The news media. The news media for so many Americans and people around the world is not the traditional news media. It is Facebook, it is Twitter, and it is Fox News. I might not wish that were the case, but here we are. And of course, traditional media sources and even Fox and whatever use those platforms to spread the message, and they are very useful. They're not bad unto themselves, but that's where we are right now, and that is where a lot of information is coming from, not just those platforms, but a lot of others. Short of the problem with speech and trying to halt speech is our protections against free speech. So the government can't really preemptively move against that. What is the response of us citizens and journalists to go forward? It's more speech. Again, I hate to be a broken record, but the truth is we sort of have to, if not shout, then certainly do more and earn trust and make it clear that we are part of the solution. We are part of the community. We are an aspect of society, not someone who's coming in and dropping in and doesn't understand the community and doesn't understand the people and doesn't share their concerns and doesn't go after the problems that they perceive in their community. And so, going back to the question about how long this will last, it will last a very, very long time. It will last the rest of some people's lives. And we have to prepare ourselves for that. But what we can do is, again, work on news literacy with young children, talk about what's false, what's not false, so that we make sure that the next generation isn't as susceptible to false news. And for the existing news media practitioners, it's for, building trust, so that when we say something, we aren't immediately shot down. It's like, I trust this person. Sometimes, you don't want your doctor to be your friend. You want him to tell the truth because you trust him or her, because they've earned your trust with that degree or their good advice. So you want that same relationship from news media. There's trust. And so when something happens that may not shed a favorable light on someone you think of, what may not shed a favorable light on your candidate, that you take it seriously, you trust it. You don't think that it's partisan necessarily because that person says you're hurting me, it's partisan, you're bad. You can question that person as opposed to necessarily questioning the source.
So we have a question from a student. Will the insurrectionists be treated by Biden as a product of Trump's singular leadership style or the US's 250-year racist legacy?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. I think one of the, although the insurrection was a very sharp event and very closely tied to Trump's lies about the election and the misinformation that he was putting out, I think it's also important to obviously see it as part of a much broader phenomenon and reflecting, dangers of white supremacy and of racial tension that are not unique to this administration. The last administration, sounds lovely, which provided an opportunity for those voices to gain much more of a public foothold than had been perhaps sanctioned before, but certainly wasn't what created those voices. And I think that what is going to be needed is to have a much broader engagement with what are the forces that fuel that kind of white supremacist thinking. What are the tensions that underlie it? What are the broader policy contexts that have been stymieing racial justice in this country? Moving on those fronts more broadly than simply trying to identify a particular event as part of a manifestation of the terrible times of the Trump administration and of growing authoritarianism, and that we have moved past it and it is gone, because I think that would be a very wrong way to proceed.
Thank you. We have one more question. When is the right time to begin learning the lessons from this experience? And are we too close still to put the events of January 6th into a historical context? I open that to all the panelists.
It's never too soon to start examining them. I think for us as viewers and certainly as journalists, know that it's going to change. News goes on, and we're still in. All right, again, I'll say it. I'm not supposed to, but we are in a very historic time with the pandemic. You cannot deny that. It's a moving target, and so it's never too soon to start examining. But I think it's a little bit too soon to start making conclusions. Saying that meant exactly this. That puts us exactly here. We're on a bit of a conveyor belt here, but one that isn't linear. And so it's never too soon to start examining, but I think it is a little bit too soon to make grand conclusions about where we are, where we'll end up.
I think that's exactly right. It will be an ongoing process, and one of the interesting things to watch will be how the understandings and accounts may change over time from this immediate moment to broader historical narratives.
I would say as well, it is important to acknowledge the lessons presently, but this needs to be an ongoing process, and to acknowledge what happened at the Capitol for it to be rooted in a historical context, because where there's often racial progress and progress in terms of other historically marginalized identities, you often see a real regression. And so I think it's important to kind of look at this from a historical perspective, so that we don't repeat this.
Thank you. I want to be mindful of our time, and I want to thank today's panelists and our entire audience so much for taking the time to come together, to have these dialogues, to pause. Oftentimes we're running to the next things, but to pause and reflect and to really learn as a community together. I have to say, for me, it's been incredibly affirming to connect with all of you as a community and to listen to through each of your lens and your perspectives about where we've been, where we are today, where we're going, and as we're looking to the future and the hope for the future as we're partnering together as a country. And I'd like to thank Professor Metzger, Dean Haskins, Dr. Holder for their time and thoughts. And it really helps us to take the long view, right? And to look ahead with anticipation for positive change. I wanted to share, as President Biden shared in his inaugural address, and this is a quote from his address, "For without unity, there's no peace, only bitterness and fury. No progress, only exhaustion, outrage. No nation, the only state of chaos. This is our historic moment of crisis and challenge. Unity is the path forward." And I have shared, I have hope. I have hope that we will continue to come together as a community, both locally here at Columbia and ultimately as a country, to celebrate our diversity, to share our different perspectives, and to continually to move forward as a community and as a nation. As a reminder, we always love to hear from you at University Life, so you can always reach out to us via email at universitylife@columbia.edu. You can also, follow it. We were talking about social media. You can follow us on social media. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook and on Twitter with University Life. You can also follow me as Joseph Greenwell, as your VP. And there's a lot of information on the University Life's website as well to engage with, including exciting future events similar to conversations like today. So again, I'd like to give gratitude to our panelists, give gratitude to each of you, and I wish you all a wonderful and wonderful evening. Take care.